Would you like a song while you're waiting?
Foam fingers may not have been the official symbol of the Games, but they were one of the memorable props used by the 70,000 volunteers who made the Games such a huge success.
Roll it, keep that ball a-rolling, keep that ball a-moving, go ball!
For many of us, this was the moment volunteering emerged from the shadows and came into the public spotlight. But has it remained there? I'm Andy Haldane. In my day job, I'm Chief Economist at the Bank of England, travelling the length and breadth of the UK to understand what's happening in our economy. That means talking to people running companies or working for government, all of them in paid work. But on these visits, I've been struck by the growing importance of a very different group of workers whose efforts are unpaid, the volunteers. So this begged the question in my mind, just how big is this volunteer workforce? I asked some people I know for their guesses. How many people in the UK do you think volunteer regularly?
I do not know the answer, but I would hope it's a large number. I'm going to say 20,000.
500,000?
I reckon it's 200,000.
It's not a big number. 1 million.
OK, so this wasn't quite a random sample. Those were the Bank of England's economic forecasters. Not for the first time, I'm afraid. They were a bit out with their guesses. In fact, when I dug into the numbers, and I'm a man who likes a number, I found something pretty extraordinary. There are an estimated 15 million people in the UK who volunteer regularly, perhaps double that number if you include people who give some time to volunteer each year. And it's not just its size that's striking. This army is as diverse as it is large, being evenly spread across all age groups, genders and ethnicities. So here we have an enormous and diverse legion of volunteers working on our hospital wards, on our sports fields, in our local libraries, yet hiding in plain sight. So I asked myself this: how would our world look if this army of altruists were to simply disappear overnight?
You can just think off the top of your head about our sports clubs would close, our museums, our libraries would have very little support in terms of our hospitals, our criminal justice system. Our environment would be not looked after in the same way. It would be a desert, really, in terms of the sorts of support and facilities that we've become used to.
You're painting a picture where, I mean, society as we know it starts to crumble, actually, if the volunteers were to down tools.
Indeed, absolutely. I think they would.
That's Justin Davis-Smith of the National Council for Voluntary Organisations, and Justin poses quite a challenge. Would our communities really become deserts without this unpaid and perhaps unsung volunteer army at our disposal? In this programme, I want to explore that question. How important are volunteers in society? And if they really are the backbone of our communities, should their efforts be better harnessed, or indeed better appreciated, than they are at present?
Okay, now uncross your band again. Pull it a little tighter, and we're going to pull from your knees to
Not all volunteer events are on an Olympian scale. In fact, most volunteering takes place in small settings, like this session for people with multiple sclerosis in Chelmsford, Essex.
OK, now watch how she holds the band with her hands. It's important. There you go. Hang on, I've got my...
This is Anne Davis, and she volunteers at this MS group every Monday morning. Today they're playing a sort of indoor bowls, and I have to say it's pretty competitive. Anne's route to this job had a familiar starting point. She was an Olympic Games maker.
I was in the common domain, in other words, in the whole of the Olympic Park. So I was one of those people you saw as you came, you left. I took photos, I high-fived you, I directed you to this, that and the other. To me, it was like I had one long party in the park. It was the most amazing experience of my life, and I think every single Games maker will tell you the same thing.
Anne volunteers today through an organisation called Join In, a charity formed to harness the energy of that 70,000-strong Olympic volunteer army. She's what they call a hidden diamond, a group leader for her community in Essex. And her work is making a real difference.
The MS Society has a core team of people, of paid staff, but everything that's happening out here at grassroots, everything is done by volunteers. So if we didn't do this, it wouldn't be there for these people. nothing will be happening. So I think it's just important for that. I see it as a voluntary job. It's something that I've committed to do. It is good to see people enjoying themselves and their lives improving. And I love doing it. Feeling that I'm doing something there is, yeah, that's important. That's important to me.
Anne is a retired deputy head teacher, one of the many retirees who have the time and skills to volunteer in their communities through organisations like Join In. Rebecca Birkbeck is Join In's chief executive. Her experience suggests the benefits of volunteering are every bit as great for the volunteers as for those that they help.
There is an exchange going on. It's not a commercial one. It is altruistically driven, but it's not purely altruistic in that people get both physical and mental benefits from being a volunteer. When you start putting numbers on the increase in well-being for the volunteers, the increase in mental health for volunteers, and reduction in NHS costs as a result of people doing volunteering, you start to get to a number of about £3,000 per volunteer.
Ah, some numbers, good. Those are a key part of my day job at the Bank of England. But they can also be a real help when it comes to my second job, which is as one of those 15 million volunteers. So we've moved from my rather grand building that I work in at the Bank of England to my second life, which is a charity, Pro Bono Economics, that I helped found around 6 years ago. We just hopped across the river, just overlooking Waterloo Station here. We've swapped the marble floors for these nice blue carpet tiles. It's quite a contrast from the day job, I think it's fair to say, at least in terms of surroundings. Although this is using economics too. It's using my skills, and the skills of other economists, to try and make a volunteering difference to charities. Here we are. Morning, guys. Morning. I helped set up this charity when I realised that economists are rubbish at digging ditches and painting sheds. But hand us a spreadsheet, and even we can make a difference. But for many volunteers, it's not the numbers that matter.
I'm Rosie Willis, and we've just arrived on the 3rd floor. We're just going to go into Tony and Guy ward now, and I do a shift here twice a week.
This is King's College Hospital in South London, and Rosie is giving a tour of the children's ward. She is one of the Hospital Trust's 1,700 volunteers. For her, this role is quite special. Rosie uses a wheelchair due to the effects of cerebral palsy, which means finding a role in the world of work has not been easy. Listen to how the hospital's volunteering programme has changed Rosie's life.
I'm 45, not 25, and as a woman with a disability as well, it was quite scary coming into the volunteer programme thinking, wow, is everybody going to see what I can't do? Rather than stopping to look at me as a human being and think, well, okay, I may have a deficit in terms of not being able to walk, but the skill set that I have is working with children and working with people. I'd suffered from depression very, very badly, and I had lost all my confidence. I never wanted to do admin, and as a special needs child in the 70s, that's all we were told we were capable of. And I was quite a rebellious child. I was like, until somebody actually tells me no, I'm actually going to find out for myself. So I'd been a volunteer at Great Ormond Street for 2 years, and I was the first disabled volunteer there, and I was working directly with children, which I loved. But then I'd had years where I'd been very, very ill, and somebody said, well, look, why don't you apply to another hospital? And I was like, but they're not going to take me because of the mental health difficulties. They said, just apply. So I did. And I got on the recruitment day and I was absolutely terrified. I kept thinking, no, they're not going to want me. I had my hair done just in case because it felt really, really important. And I got home and there was an email waiting for me to say that I'd been accepted. So I got my husband literally to jump up and down in her bedroom. And I've been here 4 years. And it's changed my life in terms of my own mental health. And I believe for people that do suffer from long-term health conditions, that actually work and volunteering is the key. Because you have responsibility, you have something to do. Because the smallest things can make the biggest difference. It's made a huge difference to my life.
Rosie, whose hair was still looking lovely by the way, illustrates better than anyone I've ever met how volunteering can transform a life for the better in ways numbers will never be able to capture. Hers is in one sense a unique story, yet it was a story I kept hearing as I met one volunteer after another. And that should come as no surprise. Studies show that volunteering improves self-confidence and self-worth, as well as workplace skills. But we also have a psychological blind spot, which means we don't fully appreciate the personal benefits we get from giving. Until, that is, we do it for ourselves. So far then, so good. But it would be wrong to think that volunteering programs are flawless. It would also be wrong to think that just because volunteers are unpaid, that volunteering programs come for free. King's College Hospital may well have the largest volunteering program in the UK, but that comes at a cost of nearly £400,000 each year to recruit, train, check and supervise these volunteers. At a time when public money is tight, is this money really well spent? Petula Story is head of hospital volunteering.
The King's Fund did a report in 2013 about volunteering in acute trusts, and their figure is about £11 is what they say is return on investment for every pound invested. And so looking at sort of a rough calculation, we expect our volunteers to do about 3 hours a week. So with the number of volunteers we have, it's about 260,000 or so hours is what our volunteers do, which equates to, again, around nearly £3 million worth, if you take the figure from the King's Fund of £11. So it's quite a big sum, I would say.
So this is a model that seems to work for you. Why couldn't it work right across all hospitals across the country?
I think there's a misconception that volunteering is free, and I think people need to be aware that there is a significant amount of resource and investment needed to have a volunteer program, but as I hopefully have indicated, the benefits are vast, and I think if people see that, this program could easily be replicated across the NHS.
So there's a growing number of volunteers.
Yes.
I mean, have they been filling the gap left as paid members of staff have been cut? Has that caused any problems, any resentment?
Absolutely not. Volunteers are not in roles that staff members do and are not seen in roles to replace staff. Volunteers are there to improve our patients' experience. They have time to have the longer conversations.
Everyone I spoke to at King's believed the work of volunteers not just help patients, but help ease the burden on paid staff too. But it can be difficult and delicate managing paid and unpaid workers side by side. That's why mobilising a large volunteer workforce is not without controversy.
You look at our own organisation, Unison, we've got 1.3 million members, 40,000 volunteers. So we are a volunteering organisation. But I've got to admit, a number of people do believe that volunteers are just replacing workers, and that cannot be good for society.
Dave Prentice is the General Secretary of Unison.
People have always volunteered, and we support that. We always have done. It's part of the fabric of our society. Where it's become an issue has really been over the past few years, where we've seen with the austerity agenda, nearly 500,000 jobs go in our public services, and many low-paid jobs have gone. And the worry is that as the jobs go, and people are being in trained work, they're replaced by volunteers who do not know the job. They're providing a worse service in some respects, but it creates tensions between those staff who remain, who are now having to supervise volunteers, rather than work alongside colleagues who would help deal with the problems.
And is there a way those tensions could be managed in a way that worked for both paid employees and for the volunteers themselves?
It can be managed if it's managed well. The issue is it being managed well? When we see many of our libraries either closing or the full-time staff are being made redundant, and then volunteers come in and do those jobs. And that, again, does create an issue of fairness.
This has echoes of a debate that came into the public spotlight 5 years ago, at the very start of the last coalition government. Who remembers the big society?
Bigging up the big society, as David Cameron insists it can work. He praises examples of volunteers serving their local communities and denies it's all a cover for spending cuts.
It is not a cover for anything. It is a good...
As Minister for Civil Society, MP Nick Hurd was one of the early evangelists of the big society. When I spoke with him in his Westminster office, I quickly spotted a vivid example of why the big society may have had such a small impact. So I'm just looking across your desk to a cartoon you have of two old men engaged in a boxing match, slightly overweight, both of them actually. One with big society on his tummy, the second one with budget cuts in his tummy, engaged in some sort of battle. I wondered who won, who scored the knockout punch?
Well, the cartoon's there for a reason, because that was my life for 4 years, this wrestling match between the big society and budget cuts in the public's mind. And, I have to be very frank, we struggled to build trust around the big society because too many people saw it as a cover for cuts. And I think it's a politician's answer, but I think it's a bit early to say who's won that one.
Even if the words big society have faded from view, the current government continues to carry a torch for volunteering. In its pre-election manifesto, they suggested giving every worker in a company above a certain size the right to 3 days off a year to volunteer. This hasn't met with universal approval. Some worry about the costs it might impose on companies, or that it comes dangerously close to mandating something voluntary. And some think it's simply wrong-headed. One of those is philosopher and former New Zealand politician Jamie White.
Over recent decades, and especially under this Conservative government, there's an attempt, it seems to me, to mingle the state and what some people call the third sector or the charitable sector. I personally find that very regrettable. I find it actually slightly sinister. I very much disapprove of the term voluntary sector. All work is voluntary. Slavery was abolished quite a long time ago. The contrast is not between voluntary and involuntary work. The contrast is between paid work and work for which you don't get paid. There's an obsession with virtue. I don't really care. I don't care if people are virtuous or not virtuous. I care about the system. Is the system one which leads on the whole to good outcomes? And the voluntary system isn't a good system. It's a backup system. It's what you want when the main system hasn't quite worked for various reasons. It shouldn't be promoted. It should be something that we think of as, well, it's a shame we need it, but we do. But we don't want the government encouraging it.
So there's a fly in the ointment. And that's not the only one.
Here's another thing I don't like about voluntary work. It's very difficult from a managerial point of view. I don't know if you've ever managed volunteers, but it's very hard to push them around it's hard to be tough on them, right? Because, well, I'm just, I don't have to bloody be here, and you're not paying me and so on. And so you can't discipline them. And it can be an absolute shambles. There's an unprofessionalism often, and a lot of waste, and a lot of chaos. And if something can be done in the normal way, through people who are being paid, who are professionals, who are under the normal disciplines that come with all of that, things tend to go a lot better. And here's where you see the vanity, to some extent, of voluntary work. Really all I'm doing is donating my labour. I'm donating the value of my labour. I could do it another way if I wanted. I could work at my main job. I could earn quite a lot of money, let's say, and then I could hire somebody using the money I've earned in my main job to go and do the voluntary work I did. Now, that would be a far superior thing for me to do morally. The difference is that I don't get the satisfaction of going off on my volunteering day and feeling good about myself with all my chums and my T-shirts.
Ouch, that hurts. But what if Jamie White is right? That would pose a pretty fundamental challenge to the volunteer army, of which I am part. So how do we prevent volunteering becoming a vanity act? And how do we organise it more professionally? MP Nick Hurd again.
There are two really big market failures. One is we don't have enough evidence about the value of volunteering. If we could really build a proper evidence base about the value of volunteering to volunteers, we could create a virtuous cycle, because people then understand, God, if I got involved in that, I'll be more employable, or I'll be healthier, or whatever. We need better evidence about what works for charities in terms of managing and structuring and presenting these opportunities to people, because this is done on a haphazard way. And then, last but not least, we need to have better infrastructure that connects people with the opportunity to give, because it goes on everywhere and because it carries on, stable, steady, very British. We don't use quite enough imagination in the public sector, at least, but I think arguably in the private sector, think, well, actually, how could we do more to harness the energy of our citizens?
One way of meeting these challenges is to have structured volunteering programmes operating within private companies which use and develop the skills of their employees. And for many of the country's bigger companies, that's just what they've done. Around 70 of the FTSE 100 companies in the UK run a volunteering programme for their staff. But volunteering programmes can be difficult to initiate among smaller companies. Difficult, but not impossible. So I'm here in Yorkshire, where I grew up. Actually in Sheffield, where I went to university. I'm visiting a small business, construction business, up here in Sheffield, try and find out a bit more about how volunteering programmes might help with their recruitment and their retention of staff. Here at Henry Boot, at their headquarters, it's like a castle actually. Henry Boot is a 127-year-old construction company with over 100 employees. Inside their grand headquarters, I met Katie Nunn. She's been working for the company for nearly 5 years, and she told me about her role in one of Henry Boot's most recent voluntary events.
Our most recent project is the Sheffield Parent Carer Forum for children with learning difficulties and disabilities. We volunteered a number of staff that went down to the Sheffield area basically to help look after children and their families so that parents could get a break for a couple of hours.
Are there particular skills that you've brought back from your volunteering experience then?
Yeah, I've probably gained more confidence, more leadership abilities, more awareness, probably just a greater outlook of what's actually happening in the world instead of just being in a bubble basically in an office.
If it's offering so much to you and other staff, what is it you think that holds back other companies then from offering this?
I think it's probably the resources, the time, money. We're very willing to cover other roles and to support each other. So if somebody does go and volunteer, we'll support that absence for that day or however long that we need to cover it for. And I think a lot of other companies probably don't have the resources to cover that gap.
With her was Karen Fisher, the company's business development manager. She helps make employee volunteering possible. For a small company, this often involves a lot of juggling and plate spinning.
Well, each request is managed and considered because it all depends on whether it's going to have an impact on the business. For example, you couldn't just take a site manager off-site at very short notice, but you could probably take a quantity surveyor.
What have you found to be the main benefits of Henry Boot offering these volunteering options to its staff?
I suppose we get the commitment, we get the loyalty. And because of this, we have one of the lowest churn rates in the construction industry. So it has a positive effect on the employees and on the business.
And you think that might be in large part down to what you're doing on the volunteering programmes?
Whether it's a large part or not, I'm not 100% sure, but it has got to play a part on their well-being and their happiness within the company.
So enlightened companies, big and small, can play a key role in making volunteering more efficient. And so too can technology. That's where LinkedIn, the massive online professional networking site, plays a role. In 2014, it launched a volunteering program of its own in the United States called the Volunteer Market. And in January this year, the service came to the UK and Ireland. Nearly 500,000 professionals have already ticked the box on their profile expressing an interest in volunteering. Meg Garlinghouse of LinkedIn explains that the key is to make use of a person's professional skills.
One example I remember so vividly is a marketing executive who is based in Palo Alto, and she had been asked multiple times to bake cookies for her local school. And she wasn't a very good baker. In fact, she found it very frustrating. She spent hours and hours baking cookies that ended up burnt and broken. And she kept reflecting to herself, gosh, I have all these marketing skills that could be put towards a fundraising campaign where I'm certain that the output would be far more than selling, these batch of badly cooked cookies. So what we do is we take our professional colleagues and we connect them with skilled volunteer opportunities using the natural jobs algorithm that we have to make those connections really, really valuable and targeted and personal.
And without giving away the secrets of the temple, just how does this algorithm work for matching the volunteers to the charitable projects?
Our algorithm works exactly like our jobs algorithm works. Our algorithm looks at the key attributes of the professional and then matches them to the key attributes of that skilled volunteer posting. To date, there's about 65,000 skilled volunteer opportunities on the platform at any given time, which is pretty extraordinary. But also I wanted to point out there's 65,000 opportunities, but there's 7 million professionals who want those opportunities. So there is what we call a volunteer gap. that the appetite for people who want to make a difference outweighs the opportunities to make that difference.
LinkedIn's experience suggests that the benefits of skilled volunteering go well beyond the philanthropic. Meg Garlinghouse again.
When we first added the volunteer causes section to the profile, we actually did a survey to hiring managers around the world. And in the UK, 55% of hiring managers stated that they considered volunteer experience to be equivalent to paid experience when evaluating the candidate.
And that statistic is telling when it comes to people looking for work. A scheme run by the Department for Work and Pensions encourages people with long-term difficulties in finding a job to volunteer in order to build their CV and their skills. That sounds fine in principle, but it may come dangerously close to compelling job seekers to volunteer, undermining the very ethos which underpins voluntary activity, says Labour peer Patricia Hollis.
A lot of the charities have now withdrawn from community work placements because they see it contaminated by the concept of workfare, and therefore too many people going into those programmes are grudging about it. Instead, I think the charities should be coming forward with their own offer, and they see how they build a pathway so that young people can find a volunteering niche that they see as a lifetime commitment, whether voluntary or paid, and then they come back to the Department of Work and Pensions, ensure how that then is wrapped around with the training for job skills that young people also need to acquire over time. What worries me is if young people's first exposure to volunteering and voluntary work, which may be life-enhancing for the rest of their lives as well as the people they're working with, if their first exposure is contaminated by concepts of compulsory workfare in the community, then as soon as they get a full-time job or a job that's acceptable to the Department of Work and Pensions, the voluntary sector may never see them again, and we've lost potentially a really rich resource for all our society.
Harnessing the enthusiasm of youth was the rationale behind the creation of the National Citizen Service in the UK. It began in 2009 with 158 people. By the end of this year, more than 200,000 teenagers will have completed the 4-week summer course, combining outdoor activities with volunteering projects. On a wet and windy August day in Newbury, this NCS group was showcasing their volunteer projects, and the weather didn't seem to put them off.
I thought it was like a really scary thing to do before because I hadn't really done anything like it before. But since I've done NTS, I felt so much more confident. And I think if I could actually do like charity work in the future, and I'd be happy to go confronting people in the streets and stuff. I feel so much better about it now.
I think that there's a lot of prejudice from our generation towards volunteering because it's something different, like something new that you haven't done before. So they're generally quite scared of it because they don't know what it's going to be like. They might find it boring or get just dragged down by something and feel like they have to do it rather than they're wanting to do it. All I would say is that it's such an amazing thing to do because if you can make someone's day just by talking to them for a couple of minutes, then to give them that interaction, it makes you feel just as good as them.
Teenagers are seen as people who aren't capable, but we are fully capable. We've got a lot of enthusiasm and our ideas are really developed, so we can definitely help people listen to us and do the right thing.
I think all of us really have been brought up, and all the different ways in which we talk about young people to often be quite negative. They're either a kind of problem to be solved, or they're feckless, or even feral is some of the language that's used about young people. And actually, this age group is volunteering more than any other age group, including the recently retired, and those are government figures from the Community Life Survey.
Michael Linus is the Chief Executive of the National Citizen Service. The NCS costs roughly £1,300 per person, with individuals contributing £50 each. The Treasury has calculated that every pound spent is worth over £6 in value to the community. But as Michael Linus explains, those benefits can reach much further.
When you give people an opportunity, give them the skills and give them the respect, they run with it and they actually light a spark in their head. And that's the thing I think that separates those who are sometimes successful in life and those who aren't. And increasingly in a service economy, how those young people are going to be able to interact with really diverse customers that are walking in off the street, how they're going to be able to make sure they turn up on time and stay for a full shift. all those sort of things that young people learn as they're volunteering are going to be really important for the economy of tomorrow. And we think that a recognition from society that alongside academic results, that actually a young person might have a social CV where their participation in things like NCS would actually be recognised. And we think increasingly employers want to see that, universities want to see that, and framing different ways for young people to stay involved throughout their life. So when they go to university, when they get their first job, when they're having kids for the first time in their 20s and 30s, then when they're retiring, I think there are all sorts of ways throughout the life cycle in which people can give back. And I think if we start when young people, when they're on the cusp of adulthood, and get them hooked at that age, then we'll find that they'll want to stay engaged throughout their life.
Making volunteering a lifelong habit should deliver lifelong benefits. And there are other ideas for getting volunteering into busy people's lives. Justin Davis-Smith again, from the National Council of Voluntary Organisations.
There are some really exciting new ways of thinking about volunteering now. Micro-volunteering I like. This is the idea that people want to be able to dip in and out of volunteering at times that suit them. Particularly with developments in new technology, it means that we can offer opportunities for people to volunteer on their smartphones, on their tablets, on their computers in their lunch break. The other thing I'm struck with at the moment, building a bit on the time bank principle, where people can log the contribution that they've made and then claim it back from a service from somebody else in the local community. One I like particularly is Spice Time Credits, which has actually created its own currency that gives you a time credit for every hour that you've engaged in your volunteering. And then you can then cash that credit in with some local suppliers signed up to this. And I think that's another quite nice way of getting people to think about volunteering and just getting us as a society to think, how can we really capture this enormous contribution that volunteers make and take it to the next stage of development?
Smartphone and tablet volunteering. Nice. Or even the introduction of a new volunteering currency for the country. You might call it Bitcoin. Although, thinking about it, maybe that's an idea I should have raised with my boss first. Bringing this all together then, I just can't resist taking this back to the numbers. There's an old and bad joke about there being 3 types of economists. Those who can count and those that can't. So I turned to one I knew who could. Gus O'Donnell, former Cabinet Secretary and head of the Civil Service. How does he think volunteering scores in our measures of economic well-being? Such as GDP, a number we hear about often.
We have this example of GDP, which people think of as some kind of how well society's doing. Yet the statisticians, God bless them, have now put illegal drug trading and prostitution into GDP. And yet volunteering isn't there. And volunteering, I think, enhances the well-being not just of the individuals, but of society. It's unmeasured and therefore unvalued and has a much, much bigger impact on people's well-being than they realise.
So when it comes to measuring the economy, it's drug dealing, tick. Prostitution, tick. Volunteering, nil point. How then are we to capture the societal value of volunteering?
There are a number of different ways of doing it. I mean, one would be if it wasn't done by volunteers but had to be done by the individual themselves or by the private sector or by the state, how much would it cost? So that's very straightforward. Secondly, what would individuals be prepared to pay for that if they had to pay for it? That will give you a willingness to pay measure, if you like. What these things miss out, of course, is the value to the individual. So actually, if you start to say to people, OK, now you've been volunteering for a while, I'm sorry, we're not going to let you do it, how much would they be willing to pay to carry on being able to do it? So there are various levels at which you can do this. They all have their strengths and weaknesses, but actually not doing it at all is the biggest sin in my mind.
So I asked one of my economist friends, armed with her spreadsheets, to help us seek statistical redemption.
So I've come down to the Bank of England's economic forecasting department. Very still down here, people beavering away. And I've got Joanna Collings with me, who did the work to put some numbers to the value of volunteering. So Joanna, tell us how big a contribution volunteering makes to the economy. Joanna, what is the number?
Well, it's at least £50 billion, and it could be as much as £100 billion per year.
Even for me, that's a big number. The value of volunteering is at least the annual cost of defending the country. or educating our children, and it could easily run to the yearly cost of running the NHS. So would a world without volunteering be a societal desert? Volunteering is no panacea for society's ills, and nor is it always organised as efficiently as it might be. But if my experience in making this programme is any guide, our society, if not a desert, would certainly be less fertile without it. Where volunteering works, we should do more to encourage it, invest in it, and yes, measure it. And then maybe as policymakers, we should know when to stand aside. What motivated the volunteers I spoke with on this programme was a force that sometimes baffles economists: altruism, that mysterious inner voice that tells us to do good for others as well as ourselves. It's a powerful motive, but one that can be easily crushed by clumsy attempts to reward it, monetize it, or indeed mandate it. This altruistic army, huge in numbers, hiding in plain sight, clearly benefits individuals and societies in ways which economists, with their numbers and spreadsheets, will simply never be able to measure. And no one captures that simple truth better than hospital volunteer Rosie Willis.
I would say to any disabled person out there, or any person that's retired or student, look into volunteering. It's not that nice, cosy thing that you do to fill time. I get more out than I give, hugely, and I want to take everybody home.